We're going to hear from Gabriel Zucman at the University of California, Berkeley, telling us about globalization and tax justice. So Gabriel Zucman is part of the coordinators of the report, and his work has really been about putting on the map the issue of globalizations and how the rich really can take advantage of globalization to escape taxation and capture, therefore, an unfair share of the gains from globalization. So we look forward to hearing his remarks. Gabriel.
Well, thank you very much for being here. So we've talked a lot about data and trends in global inequality this morning. I'd like to talk about policy. How can we make globalization and tax justice compatible? I think it's one of the most pressing policy questions of our time. It's becoming clearer by the day that globalization makes redistribution harder. It makes it harder to tax multinational corporations. In 2015, for instance, Google Alphabet, which is one of the biggest corporations on the planet, made $15.5 billion in profits in Bermuda, where the corporate tax rate is a relatively modest 0%. So that's one problem, and you have growing profit shifting to zero tax countries like Bermuda. You have a race to the bottom in corporate taxes with big declines in statutory corporate tax rates. The US is going very likely to move from 35% to something like 21%. France is going to move from 33% to something like 25% in the years ahead. Globalization has also made it simpler for wealthy individuals to move assets across countries in ways that makes it easier for them to avoid taxes and in some instances to evade taxes. And all of this contributes to the rise of pre-tax and transfer income inequality. If wealthy pay less taxes, they have more incentives to higher incomes or to bargain higher incomes. It also contributes very mechanically to the rise in post-tax and transfer inequality, just because the wealthy pay less taxes. And in many ways, the policy reaction so far has been quite disappointing. It's been mostly something like, let's all become tax havens. If it's becoming harder to tax multinational corporations, then let's just stop trying to tax multinational corporations properly. If it's getting harder to tax wealthy individuals, then let's get rid of wealth taxes, for instance, or let's cut estate taxes, or let's cut top marginal income tax rates. And so the question at this stage, I think, is the following. Do we really think that globalization has a future if it means ever lower taxes for the wealthy and higher taxes for the rest of us? Because, of course, collecting more taxes on the rich is not a goal in itself. It's good because it makes it possible for the rest of us to pay less in taxes. And so I think, if we want to think about this issue, I think the answer is we can do better. I really think that it's possible to reconcile globalization with progressive taxation and limiting the rise of inequality. But to do this, we need two things. We need a good understanding of the issues, which are relatively novel in some cases, not properly understood, and we need innovative policies. So what are the issues? So issue number one is rising profit shifting to offshore tax havens. So here's a graph that shows the fraction of all their foreign profits that US multinationals book in tax havens. And so in the 1980s, it used to be something like 15-20% of all the foreign profits of US firms that were made in tax havens. And since then it's been rising year after year. And the latest data point for 2016 shows that 63% of all the foreign profits of US multinationals now are made in Singapore, in Bermuda, Luxembourg, Ireland, and so on, where they are taxed at a rate of typically in between 0 and 5%. And so if this continues, in the 2020s, it will be something like, 75, 80%, and eventually 100%. So you have all the profits, all the foreign profits made outside of the US by US multinationals that will basically avoid taxation. The second issue is that very much taking that into account, governments have been cutting the tax rates that they apply to corporate profits. So here's a graph that shows the evolution of the world average corporate tax rate. So in the 1980s, it used to be, in between 40 and 50%, around 45%, and it has declined since then, and nowadays it's a bit higher than 20%. And with the US tax reform and the French tax reform and other tax reforms in other countries, it is likely to be maybe below 20% in the next decade. And so we've radically changed the way that we attempt to tax corporate profits at the very same time as indeed globalization was progressing. So on the right axis, you have the fraction of global corporate profits, which I call multinational profits, which correspond to profits made by firms outside of the country where they're headquartered, and that is reaching about close to 20% today. Now, if you look next at the evolution of individual income taxation, this is a well-known graph which is in the report on the evolution of the top marginal income tax rate in a bunch of countries, including the US, UK, Germany, France, and Japan. And there's been, as is well known, a big decline in top marginal income tax rates from as much as 90% in Anglo-Saxon economies in the post-World War II decades to pretty much everywhere something around 40%. In the latest version of the tax plan that's discussed by Congress in the US, this would be reduced to 37% and to even less for forms of income that typically accrue to top 1% individuals, so to something like 30% for them. Okay, so now if you combine everything, so you have this decline in corporate taxation, both because of rising tax avoidance and because of a decline in statutory tax rates. You have a decline in top marginal income tax rates. If you combine everything and you ask what's the fraction of their pre-tax income that rich people pay in taxes. So here's the figure for the US, which is based on our distributional national accounts for the US. So that takes into account all taxes at all levels of government, so federal, state, and local in the US. That makes some assumptions about who bears the burden of corporate taxes, for instance, and these are relatively standard assumptions where the owners of capital pay the bulk of the corporate income tax. And you have this striking figure where basically the average effective tax rate of top 0.1% income earners is returning to its level of the 1920s, so to something like 30%. So now you have to realize that in the 1920s, the size of the government was very different. The US government was about 10% of national income. It took 10% of national income in taxes and redistributed 10% of national income in transfers and government spending. Nowadays, it's 3 times larger. It's 30% in taxes and 30% in transfers, and yet we are returning to a world where at the very top of the income distribution, the tax rate is going to be very much the same. So here I'm making simple projections for 2020 based on the tax bill that's currently discussed in Congress. And indeed, you would return to something like 30% in average taxes at the top of the distribution. And so the decline started actually a bit earlier than 1980s, starting in the 60s with the first Kennedy tax reform in the 70s. There was and then the decline accelerated very quickly in 1980s. There was some rebound in 1990s, and since then this tax rate at the top of the distribution has continued to decline. So that's important because many people who see this graph on marginal tax rates, sometimes the reaction is nobody really paid these high taxes at the top of the income distribution, and nobody, few corporations actually paid a lot of corporate taxes. There was a lot of tax avoidance. That doesn't seem to be the case. There was several decades after World War II where you had indeed more than 50% average tax rates for very wealthy individuals. And the flip side of that, as tax rates declined at the top of the distribution, what we observe is that taxes have actually increased at the bottom of the distribution. So we've talked a lot about the dynamic of the bottom 50% income share in the US and at the world level. It's very striking to see that in a country like the US, as its share of total pre-tax income fell from about 20% of total income in the 1970s to about 12% today, then their actual tax rate increased from about 15% of income in the 1960s to about 25% of income today. So working class individuals who see their income stagnate, their share of income fall, pay more and more in taxes because in particular of the rise of payroll taxes. That has played a big role. It's far from being the only reason, but it's one of the key drivers of the rise of income inequality in a country like the United States. So here's a graph that gives a comprehensive view of how the distribution of income has evolved in the United States since 1980. And I focus a lot on the US in this presentation because, it's the country that in many ways has done the most radical policy experiment in terms of changing its taxes, in terms of changes to bargaining power for labor versus capital, changes to access to higher education, and so on and so on. So what has happened is, at the level of the country as a whole, aggregate growth has been quite mediocre actually since 1980. You look at growth for the average adult, and an average income has grown only 1.4% a year since 1980. So there's absolutely no evidence that indeed lower taxes at the top or lower taxes for corporations increase macroeconomic growth. 1.4% is a pretty bad perspective in international, pretty bad performance in international perspective. So that's result number one. But second, what's even more striking than that is that for the vast majority of the population, they are nowhere near the macroeconomic average of 1.4%, which really shows how, in many ways, useless it is to only talk about growth. For all of the percentiles below the 88th percentile, so for 88% of the population, macroeconomic growth has been less than 1.5 per year, and even in some cases, in many cases, close to zero or even negative at the bottom of the distribution for income before taxes and transfers. What you see also is that many people have a view that, since 1980s, the economy and globalization has been good for, let's say, the top quintile of the income distribution, the top 20%. That's not really what this graph shows. Even for the groups around the 90th percentile, people who are relatively well off, even for them the income growth rate has been quite modest. It's really in the top 1% and within the top 1% that all the action is taking place. And that shows how crucial it is to indeed look at tax data, which are the only data that make it possible to say something about the dynamics of income for the top 0.1%, the top 0.01%. For the very, very top group, we consider the top 0.001%. They've been growing like China, at 6.5% per year on average since 1980. And so a synthetic view of this, if you just compute the share of income that goes to the top 1% versus the share of income that goes to the bottom 50% of earners in the US, then both groups have basically switched their income share. So the top 1% used to have about 12% of total income in the US. Now they have about 20% of total income. So their average income is 20 times the average income in the US. The bottom 50%, on the other hand, used to have about 20% of income in the 1960s and nowadays has a bit more than 10, around 12% of total income. So this matters because if all countries, as we saw this morning, if all countries follow this inequality trajectory, this very high inequality trajectory of the US, then global income inequality is bound to increase enormously by 2050, pretty much irrespective of what happens to average income growth in each country. So that's what you see here on this graph that Luca talked about this morning. In this scenario number 2, this high inequality scenario where all countries follow the US inequality trajectory, then the top 1% income share would increase from about 20% of global income today to almost 30%, so in between 25 and 30% of global income, despite higher growth in developing countries than in the developed world. And the bottom 50% income share would actually collapse to barely more than 5%. So how do we prevent this from happening? So I'd like to talk about one very concrete and very specific, though important, tax reform that would do a lot. And tomorrow in our session on the Global Wealth Registry with Delphine Noguered, we will talk about other policies, so in particular the Global Wealth Registry and how to better tax wealthy individuals by creating more information. But just to finish today, I'd like to talk about how can we make corporate taxation work in a globalized world. Is it, should we just give up? Is it just impossible, or is there actually a path forward? And the nice thing is that there are many, policy issues that are, generally complicated and where there's no clear, solution. Here, there is actually a very clear, simple, and practical solution, which is just to change the way that we compute corporate profits. So we could say, for instance, if a company like Apple makes $50 billion of profits at the global level and 10% of its global sales are in France, then France could say, okay, we're going to consider that 10% of Apple's corporate profits have been made in France. That's going to be the tax base, and we're going to apply whatever rate we want to apply to this tax base. And that is known as an apportionment of global profits using a formula, here a very simple formula which is based on where you make your sales. And what is particularly nice with this is already what most US states do. Most US states have their own corporate tax, like California, New York, New Jersey. And that's how they compute the amount of profits that are taxable in California or in New York and New Jersey. And it works very well. What's particularly nice is that it would completely put an end to the artificial shifting of profits by multinational firms, because right now you can send your profits to Bermuda, but you can't send your customers to Bermuda. The customers, they are, here in France, they are in California, they are in developing countries. And so that would, put an end to profit shifting and tax avoidance. And the third thing, which is underappreciated, is that this can be done unilaterally. So very often when you talk about changing the way we tax multinational corporations or cracking down on tax evasion, people say, well, you need, a global agreement. This will never happen because countries like Ireland or Luxembourg will always, block and refuse to make any progress. But here, that's not the case. France, for instance, tomorrow could say that's going to be the way that we compute the amount of profits that are taxable in France. And we don't need, the agreement from Luxembourg or Ireland. We just ask any company that makes sales in France, has access to the French market, to tell us about their global profits and what fraction of their global sales they make in France. And so, of course, global agreements and multilateral cooperation is always better. But in that case, I think maybe now time has come to actually move unilaterally. We can try to convince Ireland and Luxembourg in the last 2 or 3 decades, but my feeling is that there is an urgency to actually improve things if we want to prevent global inequality to rise considerably in the next decades. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Gabriel. So before we take questions, and so the speakers are going to sit here and they are going to answer questions, let me just make two remarks after these presentations by Esther, Branko, and Gabriel. So the first one is about poverty that Esther specifically mentioned. So the World Bank measures poverty as basically $2 a day. So it's a threshold fixed in real terms, and you just count the number of people that fall below that threshold worldwide. So it's obvious that with economic growth, if it benefits the poor at least a little bit, that number is going to fall over time, and that's what has happened, with the economic development in China. My view, and perhaps the view, of the coordinators, is that such a measure is really not very meaningful. So what they try to have with that very low threshold is a subsistence level, the level under which basically you wouldn't be able to survive economically. But so if subsistence is what interests you, I think, look at something like life expectancy. It's going to have a much sharper measure of whether humans are able to survive in these societies. So I think the absolute level of poverty measured in dollar terms doesn't make a lot of sense. And indeed, within a country where there is significant economic development, countries switch to measures linked to the median income. That's how Europe does it. So you get back to measures of inequality. That is, how do the poor, a fraction of the population, does relative to a median or an average, to the things we are trying to do. The second thing I want to mention is about government. So that has appeared a little bit, particularly in Gabriel's talk, but perhaps it hasn't been emphasized enough. So one of the striking development of the 20th century in advanced economies has been the growth of the size of the government. That is, now in advanced economies, government take between 30 to 50% of national income in taxes. So it's 30% in the United States, about 50% in France, and they use this income to fund a number of transfer programs, education, investment, retirement, health, etc. So the fact that our societies have decided to share such a large fraction of the economic output we produce tells you right there that human societies, humans care a lot about inequality. If the view was really individualistic, I work and I earn and I deserve what I earn, people wouldn't tolerate such large government. So I think that's the best illustration for why we care about inequality and why you also want to measure inequality both on a pre-tax basis. That is, most of the report is based on pre-tax numbers, but we've also computed post-tax numbers to see what happens to inequality once you factor in all the taxes and then all the transfers that the government does. Let's start over here.
Thank you. Should we introduce ourselves, I guess? Should we introduce ourselves? Or?
Yes, introduce yourself if you want.
Edward Wolf, New York University. So first of all, let me applaud the effort. This is a fantastic project underway. So I have I don't know whether it's a technical question or maybe it's more of a broader issue, but the inequality measures are based on per adult. And I'm always uncomfortable with using adults or even adults as the unit of measurement. Certainly, equivalent income would be a broader measure to use when you're comparing, when you're looking at inequality and movements over time, because countries differ in the ratio of adults to total population. So, Africa, for example, has a much lower ratio of adults to population, and Western Europe, particularly Northern Europe, has a much higher ratio. So I'm not sure what you can do about that given the data. I mean, thinking about the U.S. tax code, it actually asks a question about the number of dependents. That's the number of exemptions. I don't know how general that is, but I think that might be a more useful measure to use. Thank you.
Thank you. Anybody on the floor wants to answer this one? Yes, Gabriel.
Yes, well, it's a great question. It's true that we focus on per adult income just because per adult income is the number that's used to compute macroeconomic growth. And so what we try to do is to decompose growth. So a natural way to do that is to use the adult unit of observation. But in all our country-specific work, we also consider other units of observation. So for instance, in the US, we are going to release microfiles where researchers can compute their own inequality statistics across households or across tax units, and not only across individual adults.
Sandra Flippen, I'm a journalist from a Dutch newspaper. I was wondering, the presentation by Mr. Zucman, you mentioned that a policy solution might be that to tax based on sales and not on corporate revenue streams. But it seems from a study by Nick Bloom that a large concentration of the top 1% is actually our Silicon Valley firms. And those firms are often based on two-sided markets, right? Where they don't really sell products. The products are actually almost free, and their income is based on advertisement. Would your policy option hold for these kind of firms as well?
Yes, so that's a very good question. So what's important, and I should have explained this better, is that the tax base in what I discussed remains profits. Okay, so it's not taxing sales like VAT, it's really taxing profits. It's just we need to find a way to allocate profits across countries in a way that makes sense. So right now, Google pretends that the bulk of its profits are made in Bermuda. That makes no sense. Okay, so we need to find a way to allocate the profits of Google to the US, to France and Germany, and Google sells ads to customers in these various countries, and so we could just look at the geography of their ad revenue and their other revenue to allocate their profits. So that's the proposal that I make, and I think it works very well actually for the IT industry.
Yeah. So question over there.
Yeah, thank you very much for the opportunity. I'm Tobias Orton from Germany. I'm doing PhD in economics with a background in physics. And this leads me to trying to connect this question on inequality to actually climate change, because when we're talking about growth and lifting bottom 50% up, this is connected to resource use, and I know that people have worked on that as well. So we have a budget of CO2 emissions, for example, and the equivalents to lift up and deal with the problem of inequality. So maybe you could comment on that, because the projections leave that out, and otherwise we would end up with 4 degrees or something like that.
Thank you very much for this question. Indeed, the environmental degradation is one of the other big policy challenges of the decades to come. And 2 years ago, during the COP21 in Paris, we actually released, and we mentioned this in the report we released with Thomas Piketty, another version of the global elephant that we presented this morning, but in terms of CO2 emissions. And we see basically a similar curve. So this shows the extent of the challenge. Of course, rising income levels at the bottom of the world distribution at the moment, with current production and consumption modes, increases CO2 emissions. Now, there are many different ways to lift up incomes at the bottom, and some can be with little CO2 emissions. And so the point I'm making here is that, yes, if we it's the same similar kind of message as we had this morning in business as usual. Yes, there's an explosion of CO2 emissions. So from 2 degrees today to 3 degree minimum by the end of this century, and most likely 4 degrees. But there are different ways to do it. Just one example. For instance, in Indonesia, the government was subsidizing very much kerosene and fossil fuels. and it decided to suppress these subsidies to fossil fuels. And so this has a positive impact on environmental protection, because people will use less fossil fuels and progressively move to other types of energy. And at the same time, what the Indonesian government did, in order to not create too much social tension, is that they created the beginning of a social security system with the transfer of this money. So you can have a synergy between environmental protection and inequality reduction in poor countries, but also in rich countries.
Thank you. So on this environmental... yes, so Facundo Alvaredo, which is actually the fifth coordinator of the report. So you've seen four of us, and here is the fifth. Facundo, go ahead.
No, just I am interrupting the questions that will follow. I just wanted to make one comment on the developing world, which is part of the report, and the future. And thank you to the discussants for this, and in particular, thank you to Esther Duflo for the first comment on the stress it produces on her to make some assumptions. Don't underestimate the stress it produces on some of us to make some assumptions in the case of the developing world. And I want to refer to this in this case. One of the very positive outcomes of Thomas Piketty's book in 2014 was that, as Thomas mentioned this, that many more developing countries started to release and publish fiscal data, which were hidden, not published, not regularly shown before. To mention the largest one in terms of population were Brazil, Mexico, South Africa, India. And these data are not perfect at all. For sure, these are not perfect. But this provides a new window to look at distributional issues in countries where we only had surveys for distributional, which is one of the in many senses. The construction of social statistics has been an invention of national states based on their needs, on their administrative needs. And you have to imagine the enormous machinery behind us. We have national accounts, income side, the balance sheets, the surveys, the price indexes, the exporting statistics, the central banks, the tax collections. And in the developing world, we have particular problems with all these sources. And the difficulty of reconciling these sources is enormous and puts enormous pressures on the assumptions we need to make. So as one of the positive outcomes of Thomas' book was the provision of statistics, I expect, and I talk to governments now and official bodies, I expect that one of the outcomes of this report, of this kind of work, is to push or to ask or to invite governments to work collectively and improve substantially and revise substantially the production of social statistics, because we have a problem. There's a problem because we have national accounts on one side, very, very far from surveys, very far in terms of incomes, in terms of wealth from tax data. And it's a fact that even for their own administrative needs, we need to improve the reconciliation of the data sources. And I hope that one of the outcomes of this report is it will be some improvement in this sense. This is only what I wanted to add.
Thank you. Thank you.
Maybe I'd say one thing on the environment, because to some extent, so it's the developing countries, in particular India, has for some time has played this thing that, okay, it's our turn to grow and we don't care about environmental policy, but they've changed actually around COP21. And the reason why is that it is also clear that the distributional effect of climate change are large, and in particular most of the cost of climate change are going to be experienced, are already experienced, and will be experienced in the future by developing countries due to their location, unfortunate location, plus the fact that many of the people are very vulnerable in the first place. And another thing that is relevant is that there is a tight connection for developing countries between what produces CO2 and what produces pollution. And although the effect of CO2 are far in the future, the effect of CO2 are right now. So until relatively recently, there was little, political pressure behind pollution in China and India, for example, which are responsible, which will create a lot of global warming and have huge pollution level. But I think this is changing. The Prime Minister, the Chief Minister of Delhi talked about gas chamber to refer to the situation in Delhi in the winter month. So that's kind of that's a pretty strong word. And when Sri Lankan cricket players starting to collapse, throwing up on the field, that sort of created a bit of a stir. So I think this, in a sense, the pollution is going to generate maybe. At least I hope. I tend to be optimistic, but I think it's going to generate social pressure to do something slightly alter the growth path, maybe at some cost, but probably not that much. For example, there was some costs that were just not burning the crops in around Delhi. It would cost $200 million. This is not that much compared to the size of Delhi, for example. So it is possible that it will be a cost, some cost in terms of growth, but again, like a second order cost in terms of growth in exchange of a first order cost in terms of quality of life might be eventually there might be a realization that it's necessary. And I think pollution is more likely to do it than climate change, simply because it's right now.
Thank you. Ursula Costantini from INET. So I have actually two questions, if possible. So one is, here in the report is for everybody, basically. In the report, you say that income inequality trajectory observed in the United States is largely due to massive education inequalities and other stuff. And I wondered if maybe you think there is a case for the other direction of causality as well. And also if you think that this inequality in education also may result in some high hierarchical structure of disciplines. And speaking of economics, James Ekman recently spoke of the dictatorship of the top 5 journals. And maybe you have something to say about that. And the other question is specifically to Professor Zucman. And I mean, part of your work is about reasoning on how you can lead to a change in the tax rate on high income. And I couldn't really see from this angle, but in the United States, it really changed in the course of the 50s, if that's correct. And I mean, if we can learn something from them, I guess that in 1954, there was the first decline in the rate of unionization, and the strike rates fell drastically relative to the 40s. And so I would like you to comment on whether this may be one of the factors that affected the change in tax policies.
Yeah, so let me try to address the second question. So you've had a number of changes that have happened at the same time, or roughly the same time in the US. So dramatic decline in progressive taxation and a decline in union density and the role of unions, and more broadly speaking, the bargaining power of labor, and a sharp decline in the federal minimum wage, and so on and so on. So all of these things, I'm not sure there's one, causing the others. What's clear is that you've had all these policy changes that have gone in the same direction, starting in many cases in 1980s, sometimes earlier. The big changes in tax progressivity in the US really start actually with the 1981 tax reform by Reagan, and then the 1986 tax reform, where the top personal income tax rate reaches its minimum of 28%. And that's the reason why the U.S. inequality trajectory is so spectacular. It's just because all of these policy changes have happened more or less simultaneously.
So maybe let me say one thing about the first question on education. So historically, it is always the case that education is going to expand, both at the secondary level and the university level, through government. So in all experiences, it's really the government that funds the vast bulk of educational expenditure. So that's why it's really a public decision, and that's something we've seen in the United States, that is with fiscal problems at the state level that fund a large part of education. The states have retreated from providing public education, and that likely, will worsen intergenerational mobility, because it's the lower half of the income distribution that benefits from public higher education, almost free. And we are at a level in the United States where inequality in access to the good institution of higher education is extremely high. It's really striking in statistics that we've put together with Rush Chetty and others. At the very best schools, so think about Harvard, Stanford, etc., the share of students that come from top 1% family is between 15 and 20%. 60% of students come from the top 10%, and you have less than 10% of students that come from the bottom 50%. So it's really the higher education system in the United States is really a powerful machine, to entrench inequality. Question over there.
My name is Max Lawson. I'm from Oxfam. I had a question about schizophrenia in the report around Europe, because Europe is positioned as the good guy to some extent, but I think we have also seen rapidly rising inequality in places like Sweden, and also reforms like the tax reform here in France at the moment. And I just wanted the panel to comment on the trajectory of Europe in terms of policy and inequality, because clearly it's to some extent trading on past glories. That was my question.
Well, thank you very much. And I think you figured out that Europe in relative terms performs better than the other regions that we've presented, but things could be much better in Europe as well. I mean, when we look at the situation even of France, in fact, from 1983, when really the policies are changing, there's a rise in the top 10%, in the top 1% share, as detailed work on France has shown, with incomes rising much faster than the average. In terms of tax competition, as was discussed with Gabriel before, I mean, it is Europe that invented this competition to the bottom in the corporate tax rates, moving from 40% to 30% to 20%, zero in some countries, and tomorrow subsidies for companies to settle on a specific ground. So Europe also can do a much better in the coming decades to tackle rising inequality. And the other thing which is particularly striking in Europe is this strong decline in public wealth in European countries. Minus zero levels in the UK, close to zero in France or in other countries. And again, in these matters, perhaps Europe can also look toward what is happening in other regions and potentially in the emerging world, where so far China is preserving an important amount of public wealth in order potentially to have more room for maneuver to invest in these important challenges of tomorrow. Perhaps my colleagues also want to, maybe Branko, yeah?
No.
Okay. Next question. Over there.
Hi, Roger Wilkins, University of Melbourne. I should just start off by saying it hasn't gone unnoticed that Australia didn't make it into any of those graphs. So there's been a lot of talk about the role of capital in and as a driver of inequality, and also talk about solutions being things like education and taxation. But I haven't heard much mention of the labour market and what's going on there, and what role that technological change is playing, and whether there should be policy focus around managing that. But perhaps that's just a matter of emphasis, or do the panel not think that is one of the big challenges moving forward?
So a very brief answer, and perhaps Emmanuel or Gabriel may want to add a few points. So on the labor market institution, we also indeed stress the importance for labor market regulations. We show, for instance, the declining minimum wage in the U.S. So in the U.S., the minimum wage was the highest in the world in the 1960s, and it declined actually by 25 to 30% in a period of 40 to 50 years, which is a very exceptional situation. Now, we also discuss the importance of workers' representation in corporate boards, and there are many interesting examples in the European context. For instance, in Germany, where workers are represented 50% in the governance bodies of the corporate world. In Sweden, 30%. So these are also interesting policies to be implemented in certain countries, and there's an interesting discussion in the UK for the moment on this topic, where progresses can be made. So all these are also indeed important policies to limit the concentration of capital.
Just one word actually on this last point. Really, the concentration of capital income is quite astonishing, and until one starts working with that, one doesn't really realize. But we're talking of Gini's in all the countries, rich countries, in excess of 85 up to 90, 95. So it's incredible concentration to which I think not sufficient attention has been paid.
Maybe what I'm going to say is wrong, but I think it's the case that it might be the case that in the future, technological progress will do a ton to affect inequality. But until now, when we're thinking about the new technology, etc., it might be the case that it will have a dramatic impact. But until now, I don't know if it has really had. It has not yet gone deep enough. The new technology have not yet gone deep enough in the labor market to change it radically. So whatever changes you have seen over the years, they are not certainly not primarily due to technology that have not been invented yet, and maybe not primarily due to technological progress. So we don't know what's going to happen in the future, but clearly a lot of pretty dramatic things can be happening even in the absence of that. So I think thinking about, there is reason to be worried about what might happen in the future with a different technology, but it's a culprit that is so far not yet shown their head.
Okay, go ahead.
Hello, thank you for the presentation. Stephanie Kunkel from Free University of Berlin. I have two questions. So first, we were talking about the relevance of inequality. What role do you see for the perception of the people of their own position in the wealth and income distribution? There are some findings pointing to the fact that people don't really know at which point in the distribution they can really be found. So how do they really know how big the inequality is, and if not, who's going to be the driving force, and that maybe the political put the political pressure on the system to change and work on inequality, especially given the statement if globalization has a future. My polemic statement would be: do the poorer 50% really have a future, or do they really have the chance to become richer in the future?
So this is a good question. As we know, from studying history, changing inequality is hard. It takes really a strong advance, to make a big difference. But I think what we can say today is that we've been a century ago in a situation with very high inequality, and somehow societies have been able to tackle that problem and sharply reduce inequality with the rise of government, rise of taxes, rises of the welfare state. And what we're seeing is that we're confronted with a similar challenge. So even though our governments are bigger, the inequality problem has come back, and I think, because we care, people care about inequality, it will have to be confronted, but it's true, it's not going to be easy, and it's not clear when it's going to happen. It could take, decades, but that's the challenge, and our hope is that precisely the report helps, the public understand the challenge.
Just a little note on perception versus reality. I mean, a big objective of the Wid.world project is precisely to allow anybody to actually make their own mind about the inequality situation in their country and at the level of the world by comparing their own income with the income of other groups in their society. So this is the efforts we're trying to do with the Wid.world website to try to allow the largest amount of people, the largest number possible, to really do these comparisons. And very often these comparisons are not possible because of lack of data at the top, because of big discrepancy between average income growth rates and what you see in the surveys in the case of India or other emerging countries, for instance. So this is really what we're trying to do, to ground this in more facts that are really accessible to the majority.
Question right over there in the middle.
Martin Wheel from King's College London. You talked about the growth of the incomes of the top 1% or the top 0.1% or whatever. Suppose we took the people who'd been in the top 0.1% 5 years ago. How do you think their incomes would have grown? Surely that's at least as pertinent a question as what's happened to the people who are in the top 0.1% now.
Yes, well, that's a good question. There's been a number of studies that have been conducted on mobility across income groups and how it affects the dynamics of inequality that we find. And typically what you see that there's a lot of persistence in the top group. So, if you're in the top 0.1% a given year, the probability that you're going to be in the top 0.1% next year is very high, maybe around 70%, 75%. And you don't see a lot of changes. You don't see in the US any change in that persistence over time, such that if you are able to do inequality statistics on lifetime income, we've not done that, it raises many complicated issues, but if you are able to do that, I'm not sure it would show very different results than the purely cross-sectional inequality statistics that we've shown this morning.
Can I just say very briefly on that? Actually, of course, the curves that we have seen today, the elephant chart and the previous elephant chart, they are actually anonymous. But if we cannot do it non-anonymously without individual data over time. But what Christopher Lackner and I did was actually to keep the country deciles or percentiles at their position in 1988 and then to draw the curve. And actually the results are not very different. The main shape, which is really growth in the middle, absence of growth among richer people, but basically West European and Americans, and a very high growth in the top 1% remains. But your question is, of course, a very important one. I mean, we ideally would like exactly to measure the gains like that, but we just don't have the data.
So one thing that Americans have been telling themselves to feel better about the situation of inequality is that at least mobility is bigger. But now with Raj Shetty's and Emmanuel's work looking at tax data, it simply isn't true. When you look at generational mobility today in the U.S., the mobility is not the chance for a kid in the bottom 20% to find themselves as the top 20% when they grow up is no larger in the US as it is in France. But that links to the previous perception. Stephanie Stantsieva, Alberto Alesina, and Eduardo Teso have looked at the perception of mobility, and people still think that the mobility is much higher in the US. And I think it has been politically positive, and it has become positively negative. It has helped people think that, okay, fine, I'm doing poorly, but maybe my kids will do better. But now I think they have this perception that actually it's possible to succeed, but year after year and generation after generation, they're not succeeding, and that creates that, I think in part, that gap creates that huge resentment that people feel. Because they feel, if I'm not succeeding, either I'm a loser or someone else is taking it from me. So I think this effort of bringing and publicizing data about what is the situation, both in terms of mobility, I guess that's not your objective, and in terms of the inequality is pretty essential.
Okay, thank you very much. So let's finish on this beautiful question on mobility, because we have only 1 hour for the lunch, so I just want to make sure we don't cut that short. Thank you very much to all the speakers.